Modernization, on the other hand, is the stages of social development which are based upon industrialization. Modernization is a diverse unity of socioeconomic changes generated by scientific and technological discoveries as well as innovations. When anthropologists conceptualize globalization, they do so in a number of different ways. The two main theorists in anthropology that discuss globalization are Arjuna Apatarai and Emanuel Wallerstein. For Arjuna Apatarai, globalization is non-systematic. He has a non-systematic interpretation of globalization, that is, global flows of people, technology, wealth, images, and ideologies that are highly contradictory, generating global processes that are fundamentally disorganized and unpredictable. He uses the notion of scapes, which Mike West draws from in his discussion of mediascapes in his introduction to an anthropological introduction to YouTube. Emanuel Wallerstein, on the other hand, in his world systems theory, notes that modernization and globalization is a continuation of the 5,000-year history of commercial expansionism, which will not change unless the system as a whole is changed. For Wallerstein, in his model of world systems theory, you have core countries which generate high profit consumption goods, which are then shipped to both semi-periphery and peripheral countries. In turn, the periphery and semi-peripheral countries will send cheap labor and raw materials to both semi-periphery and core countries. Core countries will utilize both political and economic sanctions, including violence or the threat thereof, to maintain the continued flow of goods and services from core to periphery and back again. In terms of globalization, we see many diverse impacts of globalization in terms of tourism and development as well. Borman's work amongst the Kofan and the Ecuadorian Amazon notes that with a decline in forest, there have been many pressures to engage in agriculture. However, there has also been the call to and attempts to facilitate the tourist experience where hunting is still utilized, and individuals will utilize the tourist experience rather than become objects of it, will stand on more equal ground with the tourists themselves. There's, of course, the paradox of commercialism within ecotourism, that you have interpersonal relationships between individuals, tourists, and locals that keep the power dynamics in the context of the local, but also noting the tensions that might exist with expansion of commercial operations and tourist operations, and how this might be sustainable in the future to continue to utilize tourism in order to allow for hunting to continue in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Two, we see with globalization the movement of people across national borders. And historically, we have perhaps one of the greatest diasporas would be the African diaspora, where you see very much a forced migration of individuals from Africa to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade. The diaspora can be defined as migrant populations with a shared identity who live in a variety of different locales around the world, forming a transborder identity that does not focus on nation building. You also have long-distance nationalism, where members of a diaspora are organized in support of nationalist struggles in their homeland or to agitate for a state of their own. Schiller and Ferron's work talks about the transborder state, where people who left the country and their descendants remain part of their ancestral state, even though they are citizens of another state. So this notion of identity transcending notions of nationality or belonging to a particular state as a whole. Initially, mass emigrations of the 19th century were seen as a betrayal to the native country. However, with transborder citizenry today, you have groups that are made up of citizens of a country who continue to live in their homeland, plus the people who have immigrated from the country and their descendants regardless of current citizenship. And this can be seen in dual citizenship programs with the European Union, as well as in Latin America, opportunities for dual citizenship. Other countries are very much resistant to the notion of dual citizenship, including Cuba. Awia Ong's work, we talked about her work earlier in terms of the spirits of possession. In her book on flexible citizenship, She talks about this notion, the strategies and effects that are employed by managers, technocrats, and professionals who will move regularly across state boundaries and seek both to circumvent and benefit from different nation-state regimes. So rather than the state controlling citizens in terms of the opportunities available for them, certain citizens, the more elite and wealthy individuals, will be able to transcend state authority and seek advantage in a variety of different contexts, in a variety of different states. So Ong's research focuses on elite Chinese families that exert special influence from their distinct position, and she looks at this in terms of the radical changes that exist as a result of their migration in terms of identifying Chinese kinship and family, the nation state, as well as the marketplace. We mentioned earlier one of the critiques of globalization has been that it's opposed to human rights. And indeed, the United Nations has been at the forefront of the international discussion about human rights as a whole. Human rights are those universal rights that individuals, merely by being human, have. They are the powers, privileges, or material resources to which people everywhere and always, by virtue of being human, are justly entitled. I mentioned earlier the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. This, along with the Bretton Woods institutions for economic trade, was a response to the horrible violence of World War II and the idea that these atrocities, such as the Holocaust, would never occur again. More recently, you see the CEDAW, or the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The signing of these documents is meant to provoke governments to defend the rights of peoples, which oftentimes have been hampered by certain local practices that enact violence on particular individuals. And we talked about this a little bit in the context of Paul Farmer's work in Haiti on structural violence. There's also the notion of cultural imperialism in the context of globalization and the idea of Western domination. Cultural imperialism is the idea that some cultures will invariably dominate others, and that one culture will inevitably lead to the destruction of subordinate cultures and the replacement of the culture of those in power. And so things like the introduction of blue jeans and rock and roll on t-shirts seen as usurping local music as well as traditional dress. And this has been framed as a clash of civilizations, or the West versus the rest, and the threats of the so-called cultural homogenization of the world, or the McDonaldization, Coca-Colization of the world as a whole. Now, there are a number of assumptions of cultural imperialism that anthropologists have been critical of. First, this denies agency to non-Western peoples, which presents them essentially as helpless and unable to resist these forces from the outside. Second, notions of cultural, or the assumption of cultural imperialism, infers that the West does not adopt non-Western cultural forms, and indeed with things like transcendental meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, the so-called Eastern healing arts, traditional Chinese medicine, anime, sushi, we see that there are a number of different cultural forms which appear in the West. And that cultural forms cannot bypass the West. In other words, the West, the US or Europe, do not actually have to be part of these exchanges overall. In the context of globalization, you see exchanges between the so-called rest, the so-called less developed countries, which will potentially dramatically influence one another. The films, Bollywood films in Indian films in Nigeria being amongst the most popular, and indeed the increase in the film industry in Nigeria itself more recently. So anthropologists have really struggled with notions of cultural imperialism as having explanations for what's happening in the global context. One of the things that's been thought about is this notion of cultural hybridization, or this notion of cultural borrowing, and that is how people tend to domesticate or indigenize ideas, practices, or objects. An ethnographic example of this would be the use of televisions and cook stoves to promote indigenous weaving, where televisions are used to entertain employees and cook stoves are used to reduce the time spent cooking so women can weave more. And so we see the idea that the change here occurs locally, and that it's not imposed from the outside, that technologies do not in and of themselves dictate how they will be used. This is, of course, much debated within anthropology and outside it as well. In the post-colonial context, borrowed images can be the venue of control from outside influences such as donors, a lot of the funding coming from non-government organizations. There's been much in anthropology about the non-governmentization or the NGOization of social activism and social movements in so-called less developed countries. This would make it more difficult for locals, the non-elite and non-Western, to navigate various cultural options. So, certain social scientists have analyzed these trends as a form of cultural hybridity or mixing. Some scholars have objected to this biological metaphor and opt for the linguistically inspired term of creolization, which refers to the combination of diversity, interconnectedness, and innovation in the context of the global center-periphery relations, which comes from Emmanuel Wallerstein's idea about core and periphery, or the systematic flows of globalization. There's also much discussion about culture within anthropology and whether culture should still be utilized overall to question the idea of an authentic non-Western society, this idea of essentialized identities and some of the paradoxes that these create overall. There are a number of problems with cultural hybridization. First, cultures have always been hybrid. They've always been interacting with one another. That they do not represent necessarily completely unique forms, but rather represent the tradition in terms of historically derived and selected for, which would include the adoption of tools, technologies, and forms of social structure and kinship that would be brought in from the outside and appropriately adopted by the local culture itself. Second, cultural hybridization ignores the reality that its effects are experienced differently by those in power and those without power. And finally, elites and non-elites of a non-Western community can experience globalization very differently. So an alternative way that anthropologists have conceptualized what's happening here is the notion of cosmopolitanism, or being at ease in more than one cultural setting, and that developing alternative modernities, an alternative sense of what it means to be modern, what it means to be a contemporary individual today, would require a pluralistic understanding of cultural hybridization experiences with particular focus on those that have been the so-called victims of modernity, or those politically and economically marginalized, how those individuals structure meaning and ideas of self and personhood today. I'd like to conclude here with a discussion on tuna and globalization in tuna, in particularly the products in not only tuna but also other fish in the context of sushi. And we see indeed that cultural competence is often given to the Japanese in this realm, as that sushi is an authentically Japanese food, and still today the imprint of the Japanese on the sushi trade becomes very important, so much so that it leads to what could potentially be viewed as a lot of waste from an environmental perspective. You have fish, for example, that is caught in New England, the shores of New England, less than 100 miles from New York City. The fish is being brought in, it's being inspected by a number of individuals on the dock, who will then make the decision whether it should be shipped over to Japan. In Japan, there are central markets for the fish, which are then cored, as you can see on the picture below here. The individuals would go through and essentially bid on the fish in very rapid fashion, and the fish certain fish would be selected for export to the United States, some of these being the same fish that came from the United States. And so you see within the course of 24 hours, something can be caught 100 miles from New York, sent to Japan and back again, because of this brand quality of sushi connected to Japan. It needs to make this journey in order to be this notion of authentic quality sushi, to have this imprint of the Japanese upon it. So I hope to have provided you with an overview of some of the key concepts of globalization. We'll talk more about modernity in the context of class discussions, cultural processes, imperialism, hybridity, cosmopolitanism, as well as the example of sushi and some of the detrimental impacts for long transportation.